Our next speaker, Dr. Ashley Whitehead Luskey, will discuss social mores imposed on Southern women during the Civil War. She will explain the rituals used to enforce what was deemed proper behavior at the time, using the Christmas celebration of 1864 to illustrate her points. Dr. Whitehead Luskey is the owner of the Past Presented Historical Consulting in Morgantown, West Virginia. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts in History from the College of William & Mary and both a Master's and a Doctorate in History from West Virginia University. She's delivered numerous public lectures, interpretive tours, and papers across the United States, and is the co-author of From Women's History to Gender History, Revamping Interpretive Programming at Richmond National Battlefield Park, an article soon to be published in the scholarly journal Civil War History. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ashley Whitehead Luskey.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming out today. And I'd like to thank the Gettysburg Foundation and Gettysburg National Military Park for inviting me to come speak with you all today. It's a real delight to be here. I'd like to apologize in advance for giving my presentation from a chair today. I'm not trying to be rude, I promise. But I've realized that being 8.5 months pregnant in Gettysburg, outside in the middle of July, early July is not the most conducive to standing for long periods of time, so I appreciate your patience and understanding today. This presentation is actually a part of a much larger book manuscript that I'm currently working on about slaveholding women's use of a variety of cultural rituals to try to reestablish social order amidst the social chaos going on in Richmond, Virginia during the war, while also asserting their own public political influence in the capital as well. Now, these highly performative cultural rituals I'm referring to included conspicuous promenades through the city's major thoroughfares and Capitol Square, theater-going, church-going, public receptions, elaborate parlor parties, benevolent charity work, and holiday celebrations. And during these highly crafted rituals, these leading ladies attempted through their dress, through their mannerisms, through their interactions with others, to try to affirm or reaffirm their own social, moral, and political authority. And they do this through a variety of means, through both forceful projection of their elite identity and their respectability as the wives of the Confederacy's leading politicians and generals, as well as through negotiations that are both vocal and symbolic with the underclasses whose deference they sought. And I'll kind of go into more about what I mean about that in a little bit. Now, it's important to note that many of these rituals that took place in Richmond during the war took place in very highly symbolic public spaces, so places where the ladies would be seen, and they knew it. And this was an attempt by them to try and lay claim over those public spaces, many of which had been kind of taken over, usurped by what they feared were social pretenders during the war. But even those rituals that happened in the more private spaces, so in private parlors and ballrooms and things like that, they're still highly symbolic, and a lot of people were watching them as they went to and from these private spaces. And a lot of people wrote about those rituals in their newspapers and in their diaries. So even those more private rituals were made public in some way. What's interesting, however, is that ironically, through all of these women's continuous efforts to try to assert their own social and political authority and to try and purge the Confederate capital of the vice and the crime and the social pretenders that they feared were really negating their authority, these leading ladies often drew great scorn and criticism from the lower classes whose deference they were trying to seek to try to preserve the social order of the Confederacy. And the reason why that social order was so important was because these ladies were partly in charge of keeping the Confederate war effort unified and solidified and going during the war. And that became harder and harder as the war went on. So in fact, as these leading ladies continue to parade about the city and engage in these rituals, their efforts actually come to alienate some of these people whose deference they really sought, and they really reveal themselves to be some of the greatest social pretenders of all. Yet, however futile these rituals of social delineation and political empowerment seem to be, they're still important to study. They're kind of a combination of urban history, women's history, gender history, Confederate history. And they're important for a number of reasons. They show a number of nuanced roles that elite women played in the Confederate capital. Usually when we think about the rise and fall of the Confederacy, we think about armies on battlefields. We think about male politicians and male generals. But these women were exerting great social and political authority of their own. This study also reveals that these women were conscious political actors. Now, even though they were denied things like the right to vote and officially influence public politics, they were certainly very active political actors in and of their own right. And they were constantly living in negotiation with the lower classes and with African Americans and slaves. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. This study also reveals how the Civil War had the power to transform what were generally smaller urban spaces prior to the war into veritable metropolises by the end of the war. And in doing so, they create a number of what the historian Mary Ryan has referred to as civic wars. So debates, tensions about public space, political power and participation, identity, social order, that really redefined the very nature of the city, both during the war and in its long-term legacies. So, with that larger context, that larger background established, let's return to the last Confederate Christmas of 1864. Now, this event consisted of 3 distinct parts, and when we delve deeply into each part, we can really try to gauge the deep meaning that these events were invested with by these ladies. Now, this event was organized by this lady that you see right here, Varina Davis. She is the wife of President Jefferson Davis, as well as some other leading ladies in the city, the wives of what I call Richmond's capital elite. So, again, Confederate generals and politicians of great influence. The 3 parts to this event included, on Christmas Eve, a decoration party and toy-making party, as well as a feast-making party that was held by some of these leading ladies for a bunch of orphans in the city. The Christmas Day events consisted of a church service at St. Paul's Church in downtown Richmond. It's just adjacent to Capitol Square, known as the Church of the Confederacy during the war because of its intertwining of politics and religion on a regular basis, as well as a Christmas party after those services in the church that was held for those orphans from St. Paul's Episcopal Church home. And the third part of it was a Christmas night starvation party. And that often intrigues people when I mention that word. We'll talk a lot more about what I mean by starvation party in just a bit. When we look at all these different parts of this Christmas celebration, we can really gauge the complex intent and really deep symbolism that these ladies obviously tried to imbue this celebration with. It appears that they had really high hopes for the wide shadow that this event might cast upon public society, but in truth, the event really has a pretty narrow shadow. That's not to say, of course, it's unimportant. It definitely still gives us a window into how these ladies perceived their social and political responsibilities, and certainly there were people who were affected by it, but at the very end, we'll kind of talk about maybe why that shadow was so narrowly cast. So setting up some historical context for the Christmas of 1864, by December of 1864, of course, Robert E. Lee's army is besieged in the trenches outside Petersburg. You can see some of those trenches pictured here in the slide. They've been there since mid-June of 1864 following General Grant's very bloody overland campaign. Now that campaign that had lasted about a month and a half or so had produced about 35,000 Confederate casualties. And that was before the Confederates even got to Petersburg, so extremely bloody. It had been a depressing autumn for the Confederacy as well. In early September, of course, Atlanta falls to General Sherman. In October of 1864, the Shenandoah Valley, which was known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy, falls to General Philip Sheridan. And of course, in November, we have Lincoln's landslide re-election. So things aren't looking very good for the Confederacy overall. In Richmond itself, Richmond is experiencing its own unique set of problems. Over the course of the war, it really suffers with poverty and overpopulation. And to give you an idea of just how overpopulated and crowded the city became by the end of the war, Richmond starts out with a population of 35,000 people. By 1865, that population has swelled to about 150,000. So that's a huge influx. And who are these people? Well, they're refugees, they're politicians, they're war workers, they're nurses, there are free African Americans as well as enslaved African Americans. And there are also prostitutes and scam artists and people who are trying to make basically a quick buck off of the war. And this results in very crowded, overcramped conditions. In fact, a bunch of middling and upper class families often find themselves sharing a ballroom with 6 or 7 other families in what was, before the war, these beautiful mansions that one elite family had lived in. So that shows kind of how the mighty had fallen by 1864, very disconcerting to these people. There's inflation, there's disease, there's suffering. To give you an idea of inflation, here is a chart of just by 1863 how bad things were. You can see the exponential inflation going on, which of course causes more tensions. Morale is really down in Richmond. It's suffering. Class tensions are high. People are suspicious of all of these newcomers who are coming in and really mixing up the social order and contributing to all of this suffering. Now, it's important to note that before the war, Richmond is a very active port. It's a very active market city, but it is not socially cosmopolitan. It had a lot of people coming and going to do business, but in terms of the people who actually resided there on a daily basis, everybody kind of knew their rank according to class and race. They knew where they stood. They were expected to abide by this very strict social hierarchy that had been in place for years and years and years in Richmond, and these people were quite proud of it. Now, this was a social order that helped patrol not only social interactions and also politics, but also delineations of public space. If you, for instance, were a member of the working classes, you were not expected nor allowed to be traversing certain thoroughfares in Richmond that were kind of the purview of more elite ladies and gentlemen. This changes basically as soon as the war starts and as soon as the capital moves to Richmond in May of 1861. This man, T.C. De Leon, who lived in Richmond during a lot of the war, he was a social commentary or writer. He wrote a lot about the politics, the social politics of Richmond in the war and how things quickly devolved and created class tensions. And he wrote about how up in arms people were in Richmond by all of these newcomers coming into the city. He says in his reflections on Richmond, quote, "In the city, where class sometimes jostled privilege, the line of demarcation was so strongly drawn that overstepping was dangerous. When the news came that patriotism dictated the abandonment of inland Montgomery for border Richmond," so this is when the capital moves in May of '61, "a surprise that was not all pleasurable thrilled to the fingertips of Richmond society. Its exponents felt much as the Roman patricians might have felt at the impending advent of the leading families of the Goths. Her sacred fanes might possibly be desecrated by profane touch, her vestal virgins viewed by vulgar eyes. At first blush of the new invasion, it is assumable that older Richmond was ready to bolt the front door and lock the shutters. Younger Richmond perhaps was curious enough to peep between them." So this shows you people's very volatile reaction to all of these newcomers flooding into their city. Now, this overpopulation, the ensuing crime and vice, unsavory usurping of public spaces and mixing of people of all different races and classes who formerly had been pretty much segregated, this gets worse over the course of the war, and you can see from this clipping from one of the Richmond papers the concerns that are being written about in the papers about all of these strangers. Who are these people? What kind of social and economic and political threats are they posing to the city? To make matters worse, Richmonders are living in constant fear of uprisings by this point in the war. Just about a year and a half earlier, April of 1863, the Richmond bread riots, which you can see pictured here, rocked the city. A bunch of lower class, some middle class women though as well, participated in these very violent, very volatile riots in the city, and people were constantly worried that this was going to happen again. They were losing control of these people in the lower classes. And of course, slaveholding people in Richmond, throughout the South as well, lived in constant fear of a slave rebellion throughout the war. Nat Turner's rebellion, Gabriel's rebellion, these were things that haunted them. And so they're constantly worried about keeping African Americans in check during the war as well. Now, by 1864, the physical strain on the city is also quite huge. Sally Putnam, who left behind a great memoir of what it was like to live in the war, she's kind of a middling-class woman. She wrote that even by 1863, the city had, quote, a worn, dilapidated look. And in October of 1863, so again, more than a year before the event we're talking about, the very satirical Richmond newspaper, the Southern Punch, just lamented the scenes that you could see in the city. The Punch wrote, "This pent-up Utica of ours is overcrowded. Refugees from every section of the Confederacy have come hither in search of safety and something to do. Every railway train bears a living freight of visitors to Richmond on transient business. Every article of wearing apparel, every mouthful of food, every Calcutta black hole of a room, every cartload of fuel commands fabulously high prices. Where this diabolism will stop, no one can tell." And by 1863, newspaper editors and even politicians are begging anyone who can to leave the city. It's gotten so bad in Richmond. Fast forward a year, the situation is even worse. The Richmond Daily Whig actually prints a poem in its columns that Christmas season, and it wonders if Christmas will even happen next year because things are so bad in the city. In that poem, part of it reads, quote, "Christmas old style, Christmas cakes and beer, Christmas comes but once a year. Christmas new style, bald-faced whiskey, sour beer, Christmas, will it come next year?" This is how bad things were by 1864. However, despite all the negative news and suffering going on in the Richmond area and in the Confederacy as a whole, there were still people who believed that they needed some lightheartedness and levity that Christmas season. As you can imagine, a lot of those people were elite ladies and gentlemen living in these finer mansions bordering Capitol Square. This is East Franklin Street, for those of you who might be familiar with Richmond. In fact, many of Richmond's leading ladies, like LaSalle Corbell Pickett, who you can see up here, I'm not sure if she's on the left or the right. Looks like she's on the right in your version. She's the wife of General George Pickett, of course. She's living in Richmond, and she basically justifies such levity in her memoirs. She says, "How could we live on the rim of a volcano if we could not dance around its crater?" And Mary Chestnut, of course, who was on the other side of her, the famed South Carolina diarist who spent much of her time in Richmond as well, she caustically notes in her memoirs, quote, "We could be miserable enough if it would help us." Even that satirical newspaper, the Southern Punch, who usually was very critical of these lavish indulgences that elite ladies would participate in during the war, says that amusement and lightheartedness was necessary during a time of war, and that those who disagreed had too much of the, quote, "pumpkin piety of Cotton Mather" in them. So, of course, referring to New England prudes, basically. Even a full year earlier, in 1863, Robert E. Lee himself supposedly had a conversation with one of Richmond's leading belles, Constance Cary, and told her that she should go ahead and found this club called the Starvation Club of Richmond, which was created by a bunch of belles to entertain young officers who were home on furlough and recovering in the hospitals. He said, "My men need to be lighthearted when they come back. They need to be basically nursed back to health in body and in mind." And so he encourages this levity as well, but not, going too much over the edge within reasonable means. And so, despite all the despondency in 1864, there are a surprising number of parties, there are balls, feasts. It's surprisingly lighthearted in some of these more elite neighborhoods in Richmond. While this does become a problem from some of the more sober-minded residents of Richmond, such as Sally Bird, who remarks just disgustedly in 1864 in her diary, quote, "There has been and is considerable depression here, and yet people have dances and weddings, and bands serenade and ladies dress and walk the streets as if there were no war. Only the soldiers, the full hospitals, and the wails of the bereaved tell us constantly of this dreadful war. Still, people say, this is Christmas time. We have to have some kind of celebration." The Richmond Daily Dispatch notes on December 24th, 1864, that Richmond is the, quote, one deep, unfailing fount of joy and consolation amid our tribulation, so justifying some kind of celebration. And the soldiers in the field note that year as well, quote, we kept Christmas and our hearts were lighter for it, and our shivering bodies were not quite so cold. Now, traditional Christmas celebrations during the Victorian era, even during the early part of the Civil War, they're quite indulgent. For people of the upper classes, they included turkey and mince pie, eggnog bowls, partridges, cakes, bonbons, champagne even. Some of these goods were sent in by relatives living outside the city to help the people in the city have a better holiday celebration. And many elite ladies clung to these rituals in 1864, thinking, why should we not be able to continue these celebrations? Well, by the winter of 1864, many of the Richmond newspapers had had enough of this talk of these elaborate Christmas celebrations that were planned for that year. The newspapers, Confederate officers, nurses in the hospitals just outrightly condemned Richmond's leading ladies for what they viewed as fiddling while Rome burned. They thought they had really crossed a line, and we hadn't even gotten to Christmas Day itself. In fact, the young Richmond artillerist, Willie Pegram, who you can see in this image right here, condemns Richmond. He says, Richmond's getting fearfully corrupt, and he blames that corruption on what he calls the parvenus and newcomers to the city, who are contaminating a great many formerly good people. So, of course, our people couldn't possibly be participating in these immoral celebrations. This is the work of outsiders. And the woman just to his left, Phoebe Pember, she is the chief matron at Richmond's Chimborazo Hospital, herself, interestingly, a former member of the South Carolina aristocracy. She's given up all of her pretensions to class privilege and deference. And she says, quote, if Spartan austerity is to win our independence, we are a lost nation. I do not like the signs and fear the writing on the wall might in time come to us. So she's also condemning the levity that winter. By December of 1864, as I said, a bunch of the newspapers are condemning the indulgent habits of these leading ladies, and they call them, quote, Confederate Scrooges for hoarding away holiday foods and materials that could and should be used for the benefit of the soldiers in the field. And the Daily Dispatch says that December, quote, incongruous and inconsistent as excess and intemperance have ever been in such a festival, they would be peculiarly disgusting and shocking in this hour of national trial. There is a time for all things, a time to laugh and a time to weep. Certainly, this is not the time for insensate joy. And they try to appeal to people, saying, you're heartless if you continue these indulgent celebrations when you should be donating any excess that you might have for the benefit of the poor and the soldiers. They speak directly, in fact, to the elite members of Richmond, and they say, even if the sorrows of others cannot touch our sensibilities, the possibility that their fate may be our own should serve to chasten the exuberance of natures which have never known affliction. Amidst such calamities as have rarely visited the human race, with a vast army at our very doors thirsting for our destruction, and a powerful government preparing to strike one more, and that a colossal blow, it would better become us to wear sackcloth and ashes, and upon our bended knees and invoke the Almighty to spare his people, than to mark the hallowed festival of Christmas by scenes of intemperance and dissipation. And so the editors of the Richmond Daily Dispatch conclude by basically begging the less sober-minded residents of Richmond to try to show some sympathy for the people who are suffering in the city and to try to be moderate in their celebrations that year. So that really begs the question, how do Richmond's social leaders, these elite ladies, the wives of Confederate politicians and generals who are governing the city, how do they go about showing modesty and temperance during the 1864 Christmas season, keeping in mind that they are always on edge about how their social and political authority is being contested? How do they reaffirm their social privilege and their political power while at the same time celebrating in a conspicuously moderate way for those who were suffering? Well, since the start of the war, the Richmond city papers had never really denied anyone the ability to celebrate Christmas. They believed that celebrating was definitely, it was a moral indulgence if it was done, with tasteful means. They saw great merit in promoting the joy of the season, trying to boost people's morale, especially during hard times. But the Richmond Daily Dispatch in particular tries to get people to understand a new conception of the meaning of Christmas during a time of war. This isn't your ordinary Christmas celebrations, and it proposes in 1861, so several years before the 64 celebration, suggestions for more appropriate ways to celebrate. And among those suggestions are ways to imbue these celebrations with charitable undertones, to try to have some kind of benevolent interaction, activity with the poor, the suffering. The elite can celebrate as long as they do so in a way that takes care of the poor who are under their care. So while the Dispatch sanctioned respectful observances of Christmas, it strongly encourages an increase in all of these beneficent, kind of benevolent activities. They believed such beneficence was a moral, indeed religious duty that was basically expected of these societal leaders. If you're going to be a social and political person of influence, you have a responsibility to take care of those who are under you, who have looked to you for all of these years to lead them through this war and to do it retaining your honor. So the papers are encouraging people that year in 1864 to engage in things like holiday fairs and charitable, feasts, concerts and shows that, the proceeds will go to help benefiting the soldiers' wives and their orphans, as well as the soldiers in the field. And one of the most successful benevolent celebrations to come of that holiday season is the New Year's Day feast that is prepared for soldiers in the field on January 1st, 1865. More women turn out, more public participation turns out for this particular feast. Keep in mind, when things are pretty bad in the city, January 1st, 1865, than they have ever seen before. People come together and they say, this is a moral and legitimate benevolent activity to engage in. Now, in addition to their concerns about how to conduct moral and kind of less material celebrations in 1864, elite Richmonders are especially on edge by 1864 about bad behavior from the city dwellers on Christmas. If you know anything about Victorian Christmases, you might know that Christmas is generally a time for raucousness among the working classes in the city, as well as the African American population. Generally, the working classes, the white working classes, tended to engage in some debauchery. There was drinking, there was indulgent activity, there was generally what people called making the night hideous for days on end between Christmas and New Year's Day. This is also a time of revelry for slaves and free African Americans. Masters and mistresses would grant their slaves a few days off in between Christmas and New Year's to go and visit family, to go and basically blow off some steam. They're also plied with excessive whiskey, however, by their masters and mistresses, which often results in some of this more intemperate behavior, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is a little bit later. So people in Richmond are, again, living on edge of what if these celebrations get out of control amongst the white working classes and amongst the African American population. Now, Christmas passes in 1861. It's fairly uneventful. People are generally on good behavior. 1862 rolls around, things are good, except on New Year's Day, 1862, a drunken mob decides to burn down the Richmond Theater, which was the biggest theater in Richmond during the time, and people start to worry. Is this what Christmas and the holiday season is going to bring in the coming years? By 1863, things have escalated yet again. Things are getting pretty rowdy, so by 64, these ladies are entering this Christmas season thinking, what is going to happen this year? Is this going to be the year of the rebellion, when everything falls apart, when all the rowdies come out and really, destroy that social fabric? So the ladies know they have to encourage and basically model respectable behavior for others so that they will follow suit, while at the same time trying to tamp down and control some of these rowdier elements of society. So with that background, that context basically set up, the last Christmas in the Confederate White House, 1864, unfolds with several goals. Number one, to celebrate Christmas and to bolster morale in the capital, as we've talked about. Number 2, to do so appropriately with strong, benevolent undertones. Number 3, to help ease the burdens of the unfortunate and to help tamp down some of these inclinations toward rowdiness. And number 4, of course, to reassert that tenuous moral, social, and political influence in the city that these ladies constantly felt was being threatened from below. So, this event, we have to think of it as both a celebration and a performance. And so the areas that it unfolds in those private parlors, the streets around Capitol Square, St. Paul's Church, those are the stages upon which this social performance is being played out. Now in 1896, Verena Davis writes a very long article for Henry Pulitzer's New York World newspaper. She's living in New York at that time, and she reflects about that last Confederate Christmas. It obviously has strong tinges of the lost cause, this rosy nostalgia to it, but we can parse out that there were definitely large grains of truth in it as well. And she writes, quote, "That Christmas season was ushered in under the thickest of clouds. Everyone felt the cataclysm which impended, but the rosy, expectant faces of our little children were a constant reminder that self-sacrifice must be the personal offering of each mother of the family. How to satisfy the children that nothing better could be done than the little makeshifts attainable in the Confederacy was the problem of the older members of each household, a debt of honor due from them to the season's exactions." Take note of that word, honor. She says, "These young people are gray-haired now, but the lessons of self-denial, industry, and frugality to which they became past mistresses then made of them the most dignified, self-reliant, and tender women I have ever known. All honor to them." Again, honor being very important. "So in the interchanges of the courtesies and charities of life, to which we could not add its comforts and pleasure, passed the last Christmas in the Confederate mansion." Now in that article, Verena Davis walks us through these 3 parts to the Christmas celebration. On Christmas Eve, she says, in the Confederate White House, pictured here, there's a toy-making and feast-making party led by herself and some of her closest friends in the elite circles, as well as some of the children of those friends. During this party, these women are using supplies that are sent in from outside the city to try and craft this big feast and celebration for those orphans the next day. The elite are also gathering homemade supplies of their own. They're also donating some of their own goods toward this celebration. And they conclude the night with eggnog toasts. Interestingly enough, these eggnog toasts include the family slaves as well. And we'll get into that a little bit later. On Christmas Day, the elites engage in a promenade, walking the thoroughfares around Capitol Square to St. Paul's Church. They attend a prolonged service at St. Paul's, again known as the Church of the Confederacy, and have a solemn day of prayer led by the Reverend there, Charles Minigerode, who actually, incidentally, is the person who brought the Christmas tree to America. So a side note about him. After this day of prayer, they hold this basement Christmas party where they actually have this feast and this toy unwrapping party with the orphans from the Episcopal Church home. Jefferson Davis and these ladies who had orchestrated the event hand out gifts to the orphans, and in return, the orphans give them gifts back in a very conspicuous display. They then crown who they call the most orderly of the girls amongst the orphans and promenade back to their homes. Part 3, the Starvation Party. Now I mentioned the Starvation Club of Richmond that was started in 1863 by Constance Cary, a young belle, very popular in Richmond. This was created to help boost the morale of these Confederate officers who are home on furlough or, as I said, recovering after time in the hospital. But it also had deeper cultural significance to it. The Starvation Club had very strict rules. It said that no food and no drink would be indulged in during starvation parties except for, quote, the amber-hued water of the James. Doesn't that sound delightful for those of you who have seen the James River? They also said only amateur entertainers were hired to perform at these engagements, so very modest engagements. And in a supposed interchange, we don't necessarily have this documented from Robert E. Lee himself. Constance Cary says in 1863, she asks Lee explicitly for permission to hold these starvation parties. And she says to General Lee, quote, "If you say no, General, we won't dance a single step." According to Constance Cary, Lee turned to her and said, "Why, of course, my dear child. My boys need to be heartened up when they get their furloughs. Go on, look your prettiest, and be just as nice to them as ever you can be." Now, these starvation parties are not just occurring in Richmond. They're documented in Fredericksburg, they're documented in Petersburg, South Carolina as well. They're basically all over the Confederacy. But these are the three parts that she talks about, Verena Davis talks about in that article. So let's go back and break down kind of the deeper symbolism of these things that Verena Davis is talking about. As I said, these ladies seem to have had this intention that this event would be some big, showcased event that everyone in Richmond would see. They'd somehow watch it, they'd comment on it, they'd be influenced by it, which doesn't necessarily happen. But again, it's still important for the reasons I talked about earlier. So this first part, Christmas Eve, we have this toy-making party and the feast preparation party held at the Confederate White House. Now this is to try to bring these elite leaders together, these women, also some of their men who are home, who are able to attend as well. This projects a kind of a sense of political unity amongst these leaders. They're coming together for a charitable purpose, they're united, the leadership is strong. This continues this elite tradition of charity, but it obviously has strong benevolent undertones, so it's morally justified in the minds of these ladies. It shows charity, it shows resourcefulness, but it also shows social ordering. At the party, as I said, elites are using supplies that have been sent in from people outside the city. And this reinforces the powerful idea that Confederates clung to of, quote, hegemonic consent. And what I mean by that is that the Confederate underclasses are relying on the elites in Richmond to basically, the poor or the middling folks will send in whatever goods they have that can be used to help others. They trust the elites to disseminate those goods amongst the needy. So it reinforces, again, the power of these elite women and the trust that people placed in them. But then, as I mentioned, the elites also gather homemade supplies for the party and donate some of their own goods as well. Again, a very conspicuous display of personal sacrifice. These ladies are engaging in a Christmas celebration, but they're doing so in a way that shows sympathy, shows empathy and suffering and sacrifice with the poor that they are orchestrating this event for. This also reinforces, of course, their right to rule, because they're doing so in a very moral way. They're celebrating very appropriately. And again, this reinforces their power and their moral justification for leading society. Then there are these eggnog toasts with the slaves. Well, eggnog toasts are certainly a way to reinforce, again, kind of the statement of political and social unity. But it's also a way to try and delineate the people who are in the inner circle of these eggnog toasts from those who are outside it. But how about the toasts with the slaves? Well, this is actually one part of a much larger set of rituals in which elite women tried to placate slaves during the holiday week, as well as during other times of the year, but especially during holiday week, through calculated indulgences in which they tried to remind the slaves, hey, you're part of the family. Hey, we're paternalistic. We take care of you. We're inviting you to engage in these eggnog toasts. This is a way of keeping slaves loyal and close to the family, behaving essentially during this holiday week, where, as I said, there's constant fear that slaves are going to use that little bit of freedom that are given to them by their masters to engage in rebellion. Frederick Douglass writes extensively about these holiday celebrations in his memoirs, and he basically talks about how this is yet another attempt by masters to try and dupe slaves into placation. He calls it, quote, part of the sick oppression of slavery that served up under the guise of benevolence, but is really yet another way to try and control the slaves underneath the power of these elites. So Christmas Day. Here is St. Paul's Church. As I mentioned, the elites engage in this promenade, walking around Capitol Square to St. Paul's Church. This is a display on the promenade of social and political authority. displaying their, elite finery, their respectable dress. It's a way, the promenade is a way for people to assess kind of other people in the city, kind of gauge social pretenders who might be out there, how the elites have to respond to those potential threats as well. So it's a way to both model respectability and kind of reclaim these public thoroughfares from others who might be kind of mocking them or pretending to be elites as well. They attend service at St. Paul's Church, as I said, the Church of the Confederacy. It regularly blends politics and religion. The Confederate cause is regularly praised and supported from the pulpit there. It's also a place to see and be seen if you are an elite lady in Richmond. In fact, a lot of the lower class young women who go to this church write that they can barely concentrate on the sermons during the war because they're so distracted by the flashy hats and other finery being disported in the church. So this is also another way to socially delineate, to reinforce power, while at the same time, supporting the Confederate cause, showing, their respectability as moral, pious leaders going to church on Christmas. Afterwards, there is this basement party, the Christmas party held for the orphans themselves. Again, continuing the tradition of celebrating Christmas, but putting on a very conspicuous and crafted display of charity, showing empathy, again, for the poor who look to these elites for their protection. Jefferson Davis and the ladies hand out gifts to the orphans hand back handmade gifts to Jefferson Davis and these other elite women. This is a very conscious display, once again, of kind of the strength of the paternalistic system. Here come the elite, ladies and gentlemen, the leaders of Richmond, taking care of the poor and the suffering orphans. And the orphans, who are so thankful for their protection, give back these homemade goods in return of thanks for the protection and support of the elites. Also, there is this crowning of the most orderly girl, which again is a very conspicuous performance trying to reinforce, pick out the most respectable young lady who can carry on the traditions of feminine respectability, the next generation of young ladies that they're trying to inculcate by supporting the most orderly girl or most respectable looking girl. Finally, there is the Christmas night starvation party that occurs in one of the ballrooms of these elite mansions. Recall the history of the Starvation Club. This is really a fascinating social performance in which these ladies are gathering. They're trying to show empathy with the truly suffering and poor of Richmond, creating a sense of unity with the sufferers. They're also performing this kind of moral indulgence for the sake of a patriotic good. They've given up their turkey and their mince pies and their champagne to help benefit the cause that is being sacrificed for by the poor. However, keep in mind that even as these ladies are giving up a lot of their food and drink, they're coming to these parties dressed to the nines. So they're reinforcing for everybody, just in case there's any question, who's really still socially on top. So a performance of suffering, at the same time reinforcing social and political power. You might say this is a rather patronizing way to try and project social power in Richmond, and it was sometimes perceived as that by some of the truly poor who said, what do you know about suffering and starvation in Richmond? So all in all, this last Confederate Christmas is a fascinating episode. Was it a successful demonstration of elite authority and benevolence and empathy with the poor and suffering? Did it truly garner the respect and appeasement of the rowdies and help to maintain a moral and tempered celebration that Christmas? Well, we know from reading the newspapers there's still an awful lot of rowdiness going on in the streets of Richmond. But we also know that for some, like a young orphan named Clara Minor Lynn, who's been sent to Richmond from the Shenandoah Valley, she remarks, quote, "The ladies came through as they had often done before." Now, for other people not directly involved in the celebration, we just don't know. There's remarkably little commentary on this event, which perhaps shows just how insular, alienated, and perhaps obsolete these women and their rituals had become by the late war period. What we do know by 1864 is that many of these rituals are being received with kind of mixed results, a mixed bag of feelings from the underclasses and certainly from African Americans. So again, they don't necessarily have the impact that these ladies were hoping to project. Nevertheless, we do have a telling quote from Reverend Minigorod from his New Year's Day service, January 1st, 1865, about how the organizers in the class that they're a part of perceived their efforts and their actions that winter within kind of the larger social and political context of the city. He writes, quote, "Reverses have followed us in many parts of our country, and the sky opens with dark and threatening clouds, which have cast their shadow over every brow. What we need is a stout heart and a firm, settled mind, and oh, may we as a nation remember that he that believeth shall not make haste. I do pray and hope that God will have mercy upon us and give us better minds and stout hearts and unfailing faith that shall win the prize." And this is the most important part, he says, "But if we fall, let us fall with our faces upward, our hearts turned to God, our hands in the work, our wounds in the breast, with blessings, not curses, upon our lips, and all is not lost. We have retained our honor. We have done our duty to the last." So in the minds of these elites, those duties, that debt of honor that's due from them because of their role as social and political leaders, that debt has been fulfilled. And in return, at least in their own minds, they had reaffirmed their own honor and their authority before those whose deference they so desperately sought. So in conclusion, you have this collage of people who participated in this event or were perhaps influenced by it. The Last Confederate Christmas is this fascinating story. It's indeed perhaps a heartwarming story. You might call it a, quote, good bedtime story. But indeed, it is so much more. It tells us about the evolution of Richmond as a city coming of age over the course of the war, and the evolution and complexity of the power dynamics between various classes and groups represented here, who are not only trying to survive, but they're trying to do so with that honor that I've kept referring to. It also reveals a great deal about the worldviews and potential social and political influence of Richmond's leaders, and again, not just the males that we usually think about, but these women who are left behind to try and socially patrol the city, to try and hold together the fabric of the Confederate capital. It reveals their worldviews, their mindsets about their responsibilities, and also, of course, their entitlements as social and political leaders. And finally, perhaps most importantly, this one little nugget, this episode, reveals how seemingly regular acts in history are often imbued with deep, ritualistic, cultural significance, crafted in highly performative natures and steeped in rich social and political symbolism. But the Last Confederate Christmas also shows how one event, one set of social performances, can be received and perceived in myriad different ways by different participants and observers, and how the staged intent of these performances can often diverge dramatically from how it is received by those who it was so crafted to impress. So it's these discordant ways of seeing between the elite, the working classes, African Americans, that ultimately came to define Richmond during the war, complicate it, and ultimately unsettle much of the social and political fabric of the city over 4 years of war that ultimately proved transformative not only for the ways that the war is civil in nature, but the way that it is also civic in nature. Thank you.